Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Salesforce Apex Hours. So today's session is OpenID Connect in Salesforce. So before starting the session, let me give you a brief introduction about myself. My name is Devarun Sengupta. I am a senior Salesforce developer at Intel. I am a Salesforce certified application architect. I am a Trail It Ranger. I'm a Copado certified resource as well. And I'm a Heroku and AWS enthusiast and a blogger at the following mentioned website. So in today's session, we will be covering all the mentioned topics. So we will start with what is OpenID Connect. Then we will drill down into the OpenID and OAuth differences. Slowly, we will move into OpenID and SAML differences. After that, we will be exploring two scenarios. One is the OpenID playground, the Salesforce OpenID playground that we have. And another scenario is where we will do a integration between Google, that is Gmail, and Salesforce. So let's begin with what is OpenID Connect, right? So OpenID Connect, if you see this diagram, right, you will see OpenID Connect is just residing on the top of OAuth, right? So, and we have discussed the OAuth flow in our previous session. So OpenID Connect is nothing but an identity layer, which you see on the top of OAuth protocol. It's just like an authentication layer that is added on the top of OAuth. OAuth is primarily used for authorization, and OpenID is kind of like a authentication layer which is added on the top of OAuth. That's why OpenID block you can see is residing above the OAuth one. So that is what this slide explains. OpenID Connect is an identity layer on the top of OAuth protocol. It allows the clients to verify the identity of the end user on the authentication performed by an authorization server. Like in OAuth, we used to have an authorization server. Like similarly in OpenID also, we have an authorization server, but only additional thing that we get in OpenID is we get an authentication layer, an additional authentication layer on the top of OAuth. So what happens is like the end users are being authenticated first. So what happens is a request first goes to the authorization server, and and the user gives their credentials based on the OpenID providers that we have. There are a lot of OpenID providers available in the market. So based on that, they basically give their the OpenID provider's credential, and once they give their OpenID provider credential, the request basically goes to an authorization server. It's similar to the way we used to have in OAuth. The request here also goes to the authorization server, but only additional thing is like before going to the authorization server, the users needs to authenticate themselves first using their OpenID provider, whatever OpenID provider they use, whether it's Gmail or LinkedIn, whatever OpenID provider they use. Based on their credential, they're authenticated first, and the request goes to the authorization server. And in that authorization server, like once they're authenticated, if their credentials are correct, they get an auth code, an authorization code in response. And once they get the authorization code in response, they basically call the resource URL, whatever resource they want to access, and they get the access token and the ID token here in return, right? That's the difference between OAuth and OpenID. So that's what it is explaining here. So it's just verifies identity of the end user based on the authentication performed by the authorization server, as well as to obtain the basic profile information of the end user. This is another important thing. So in OpenID, we get an additional endpoint once you are authenticated, once your credentials are validated, right? And once you get the ID token and the access token, you get an additional resource in OpenID, which is /user-info resource, which gives you basically the end user's information. So suppose if you are using Gmail for as an OpenID provider, and if you are using Gmail credential to authenticate, right, then we will have we will have an user info endpoint which will give you the details of the user present in the Gmail. So that's the advantage of OpenID. So before drilling down into the differences, let's first try to explain this scenario, right? How the OpenID Connect authorization flow works with a real-time example. So let's suppose there is a resource owner. Let's suppose this is myself, and I'm using a browser. I'm going to the browser, and let's suppose I'm in Yelp.com, or say I'm in Salesforce.com, and I have a button there called login with Google. I will show you like how can we configure login with other identity provider sign in, right? So suppose let's suppose an example where we are in the browser, and we have configured this OpenID Connect, and also we have enabled the login with the other identity provider or the authentication provider. Now, once the user basically clicks on that button, say in this case we are considering Gmail. So once the user clicks on login with Gmail button in our Salesforce sign in page, right? At the time, what will happen is the user will be redirected to the authorization server. Now, whose authorization server it will be redirected to? It will be redirected to the authorization server of this particular one. If it's Gmail, right, it will go to the Gmail's authorization server. Now, once it goes to the Gmail authorization server, what they need to do is they will get to see a page where they have to enter the username and password. Now, this page will be the page of the authorization provider. So in this case, it will be of gmail.com. So that's why it's accounts.gmail.com. So here they will kind of like give their email and password. Now this email and password will not be the Salesforce username and password. This email and password will be the Gmail's username and password. So once they give their Gmail username and password, so this is that extra authentication layer or this extra authentication check which we get. So they will give their username and password, and once they give the username and password, if the kind of authentication is successful, right, then they will be redirected to a callback URL, right? That's the redirect URI that we specify in the connector tab. They will be redirected to that redirect URI with a response type as code. That is they will get an authorization code in response if the authentication is successful, and they will be redirected to this URI, which will be mentioned in the connected apps callback URL, right? And once that is done, right, so once they give the username and password, they will basically get this page. This is the consent screen which tells that Salesforce in our case is trying to access this on their behalf, right? So they will get this consent screen. If they give yes after giving the credentials, then what will happen is like the authentication will be successful, and they will come to this callback URL, and after everything is done properly fine, they will get to this redirect URI that is mentioned, and yeah, they will come back to this redirect URI with this authorization code. So that's why it is greeting you with this username, the logged in username. Hello, John. So John is basically the credential of the person who has given here. So it will greet you whatever custom page you are trying to access. It will open that particular custom page. So this is how the entire flow works. So first, whenever you basically click on the button, right, log in with Google or any other provider, it first goes to the authorization server. The user gives their credential. Once they give their credential, they get a consent screen. So once they provide a consent, right, once they provide yes, it basically comes back with the authorization code, right, and it provides you that page. And internally, using this authorization code, Salesforce in our case again do a call to that particular resource, and it gets an access token and ID token in response, right? Also, additionally, as I was telling, right, in along with this authentication layer that you have here, right, where you basically authenticate your credential in OpenID, we also have another endpoint resource which is explicitly available for OpenID, which is a user info resource. So like once we get the access token and ID token, which indicates that we have an access, right? After that, what we can do is like we have this endpoint, this user info endpoint, which is dedicated only for OpenID Connect. Otherwise, we don't generally have the access to this API. So we can call this user info API to get the user details, right? To get the further user details like the profile informations of the user, the email, the first name, last name. If we want to get any additional details, we can do an explicit call out to this endpoint to get the further details, right? Let's move into the next slide. Yeah, so just to summarize then, if you are bothering, if you're thinking about what's the difference between OpenID and OAuth, right, then this table will help you. Like OAuth is basically used for granting access to your API. OpenID Connect is logging the user in. Basically, it's talking about authentication part. OAuth gives you an access to the user data in other system. OpenID makes your account available in other system. Like if you want to use any other OpenID Connect providers, then it makes those accounts available in your other system so that you can use those accounts as an authentication provider in your system. And this is the primarily difference, or you can say the main difference. OAuth is mainly used for authorization, and OpenID Connect is mainly used for authentication. It's just an additional authentication layer. Always remember, OpenID Connect is just an additional authentication layer on the top of OAuth. So coming to OpenID and SAML, right? So in to few of you, it might look like OpenID and SAML are almost similar, right? Yeah, it's almost similar. OpenID and SAML, you can consider they are almost similar, but there is a subtle difference between OpenID and SAML, right? So SAML we will cover in the upcoming sessions, but just let me give you a little bit idea about SAML, because that will be helpful for understanding this difference. So what happens like in SAML is we have a concept of service provider and identity provider, right? So let me first touch base what is service provider and what is identity provider. Now suppose SAML concept is generally used for single sign-on. Like say, for example, I want to sign into my Salesforce org, right, using Gmail credential, right? I can enable SSO or single sign-on. So in that case, SAML comes into picture. So SAML is nothing but a protocol. So what happens in SAML is, say, let's consider this use case where we want to use Gmail credentials to log into Salesforce, right? In this case, the the system or the yeah, you can consider the system or the provider whose credential we are using, that is considered to be the identity provider. So in our case, Gmail is the identity provider. Why? Because we are using Gmail's credential to validate or authenticate first and then access Salesforce, right? So that's the reason the party or the provider whose credential we are using, that is known as identity provider. And the end resource that we are trying to access, in our case we are using Gmail credential first and then we are trying to access Salesforce. So the end resource which we are trying to access, in our case it is Salesforce, that is termed as the service provider. So these two terms are very important in case of SAML. So always remember, the credit the provider's credential that we are using, that is known as identity provider, and the end resource that we are trying to basically access is the service provider. Now in OpenID Connect, the same thing, the same two terminologies, service provider, identity provider, gets renamed. It's the concept is same, but it gets renamed. The credentials, the OpenID provider. So there's a concept of OpenID provider in case of OpenID Connect. So OpenID provider is nothing but the third party that we are using, the third party that is supporting OpenID Connect protocol, and the credentials that we are using, that is known as the OpenID provider. So for example, so in today's demo, like we will be showing how to use Gmail and Salesforce, right? How to use Gmail credential as an OpenID provider, right, to authenticate and connect to Salesforce. In that case, OpenID provider in our case is Gmail, because we are using the Gmail's credential to validate. But like once the user has validated, right, the user will again go back to Salesforce in our case, right, because Salesforce is the end resource which they are trying to access. So in that case, the service provider concept in SAML is equivalent to the relying party in sales in OpenID Connect. So service provider in SAML, in short, service provider in SAML is nothing but the relying party in OpenID Connect, and identity provider in SAML is equivalent to OpenID provider in case of OpenID provider in OpenID Connect. So what happens is in OpenID Connect, like once you have seen in the previous flow, right? Once the user first gives the credentials, once they authenticate their request, right, and once they get the authorization code, and they use this authorization code to get the access token and a special token called ID underscore token. Now this token you will not get like on your own. You need to have a special access to get this ID token. So that I will show you once I will go through a demo. So let's consider like if OpenID Connect is enabled, right? What I mean by OpenID Connect enable and all that I will come in the upcoming slides. But let's suppose that if the OpenID Connect is enabled, then the user will get an ID underscore token along with access token. This ID underscore token is nothing but the OpenID token, and this token is similar like a JWT token, or it's a signed JWT token which you can consider. And this is like an encrypted information. Since it's a signed JWT token, you will not be able to like decipher from the token by seeing the token itself. But if you like kind of like decrypt this information, right, you will get the informations about the subject, right, what is a subject, what is the issuer, right, and the other user information, like similar to JWT token. Because if you remember, in JWT token also we used to have the entire JWT token broken into three parts, right? One was the header, one was the payload, and another was the certificate part, right? So the header and the header contains basically the algorithm information there, right, in JWT, and the payload is to contain these three parts, right? Subject is like the username of the user, The issuer, basically it used to contain the audience information. Audience means like whether it's the identity, whether the OpenID provider, right, whether we are doing it with Salesforce or whether we are doing it with communities, right, it could contain the endpoint of that, like whether it's login.salesforce.com or test.salesforce.com, right? So that would fall under the audience. So this ID token is nothing but similar to JWT token, which would contain all this informations. But however, in SAML, right, we don't have this concept of this ID token, right? In SAML, everything works as an assertion. It's what I mean by assertion is like the whenever you do a single sign-on, right, via SAML, basically an XML kind of a request goes, right, which we call as an assertion, which contains all the key informations, like it contains the federation ID identifier or the username information, right, and everything goes between the parties, right, in the form of an assertion or in the form of a XML request. However, we don't have any such thing in case of OpenID provider, although they work similarly, but we have a concept of ID token here, and that's kind of like a signed JWT token containing all this key information. So you will find all this key information once you decrypt that token, right? But in SAML we don't have this concept. It's just like it's a protocol, but the you can say the end goal is same. Eventually it does a single sign on, and you are able to access Salesforce using a Gmail credential. Even here also we will be using Gmail as an OpenID Connect provider, and we'll be using it to do this. But only difference is like the way SAML works is completely different to how the OpenID Connect protocol works, because in SAML we have the concept of assertion, right? So and so in other words, what you can say is like OpenID is nothing but the SAML of the modern era, right? That's how it is. So if there is any third party system which kind of like supports OpenID Connect protocol, then we should go with OpenID Connect, right? Okay, so let's see an example how we can use Salesforce, right, as an OpenID provider using the connected app framework. So we want to show you like how we can enable OpenID Connect protocol, right? In case of Salesforce, right? How we can enable the OpenID Connect from the connected app level. So, so let's go into the demo. Let's see how we can do that. So I'm into a Salesforce org. So the first step that you need to do to enable the connected app to support OpenID protocol is by going to the connected app. So let's go to the connected app first. So I have created a connected app. I'm using the same connected app which I was using for the previous sessions demo. So Salesforce data fetch is the connected app name. So what you need to do is like it's similar to the normal connected app creation, only few settings change will happen. If you remember, we have touched all these sections like use digital signature and all during our JWT session, right? So on a similar note for OpenID, what we need to do is like we need to open the connected app, right? And then we have to come to this OAuth scope. The most important scope that we would need for OpenID is this particular scope, allow access to your unique identifier. This is the OAuth scope that we need to give to ensure that we get that ID underscore token in the response. Unless we give this scope, right, we will not get the ID token that we are talking about in the response. So this is the scope that we need to give in our connected app. After that, we need to check this checkbox, configure ID token, right? Once we give this ID token, like once we kind of like enable this checkbox, it means like this connected app will now support ID token, right? And we can set the expiration of this ID token for how long this will be valid. So I've given it as 2 minutes for the timing. And we have this section called audiences. So since we are doing this particular thing for Salesforce, right, and I am in a developer uh, copyright developer org, so I'm giving the developer endpoint login.salesforce.com as the ID token audience. So ID token audience is basically the place where you want to integrate the integrate the authentication provider. In my case, I want to integrate Gmail in this org, right? So I've given the ID token audience as the environments. If it's a sandbox, it would have been test.salesforce.com. And apart from that, like you have multiple ways to include, right? You can include the standard claims, you can include custom attributes. It's not mandatory. If you want to give, you can give all this. If you don't want, then what you can do is like you can simply include the standard claims. Standard claims is nothing but if you hover over this I, right, information, it is showing that it will basically, once you get the ID underscore token, right, in response, and if you include this standard claim, then once you decrypt that token, you will get all these informations like profile, phone number, and address. You will get this end users information from that authentication provider. But if you want to include any other attributes apart from this profile, phone number, and address, then you need to define custom attributes and need to enable this checkbox, so that you will get the other custom attributes which you have defined in your connector tab. So this is the primary thing that you need to do. You need to come to the connector tab, you need to give this OpenID OAuth scope, you need to enable this checkbox which ensures that the OpenID token is configured. You need to specify the validity of the token, the ID underscore token that you get in response, right? You can specify the validity for that. And you need to give the audience. Audience is basically the place where you want to integrate with your authentication provider. And then you have an option to include the standard claims, which is the standard one or the supported one. You can provide this. But yes, apart from this profile name, phone number, and address, if you want to access any other details, like if you have any custom attributes which you have created in your connected app, you can. And if you want to basically send those informations also, then you can just click this checkbox. So then in the response, right, you will get, along with profile, phone, and email, this custom attributes also, right? So this is how, this is basically from the settings level, from the connected app settings level, what you need to do. And yeah, and if you remember, in that connected tab we were having that custom attribute section. So if you want to define any custom attribute, you can just go to this connected tab, you can define any custom attribute of your choice, and provide it's like a key value pair. You can provide your custom attribute name and the value of that custom attribute. And to pass this custom attribute, as I was showing you before, right, in the previous screen, the connected app screen, you just need to click that checkbox, which will ensure that along with your email ID, profile, and phone number, this information, if you need any custom identifier to be passed, right, then you can define that in under the custom attribute. And you need to enable that in the checkbox under include. Here we were showing you, right, include custom attributes, right? So this will ensure that that custom attributes also kind of goes along with the standard claims, right? So this is from the connected app perspective. So after that, what we need to do is, like, there is a website available on Heroku for OpenID Connect, right? So this is that particular website. This we can use for basically checking the OpenID. It's like a playground for checking the OpenID Connect. So it asks for a few things. If you see this app, if you open this app, it will ask you for the login host. So it is similar to the audience that we have specified in the connected app. In our case, it is https login.salesforce.com. Then it asks for client ID. So we can simply copy this client ID here and paste it. Then we will go to the client secret. You can simply copy this client secret here, delete everything, paste the client secret. And this is kind of like an optional. So this is important because this URL which you see here, like you can see there is a disabled sign here, like we can't specify here. So this is the callback URL which this particular app has. So if you remember, when I was showing you the authorization code flow, right, when I was showing you the OpenID flow, I told that whenever you give your credentials and everything like client ID and client secret, it will go to the authorization server. And once the authorization is successful, it will give you a authorization code, and it will redirect to this URI, OpenID Connect. This is the redirect URI which this particular app will redirect to. So what you need to do is you need to first add this particular URI here in the connected app. So if you have noticed, I have already added this in the callback URL here, this particular URL, right? If you don't add this URI, then what will happen is, let's suppose if you have not added this URI here in the connected app and you have just clicked on the next, then what would happen is, I will show you. Yeah, what would happen is, you will, first of all, you will not get an authorization code. and you will get an error called redirect URI mismatch. You will get this error. This error only happens if the redirect URI of the application is not configured in the callback URL of the connected app, or the redirect URI which this application is going to, that URI and the URI which is configured here are not matching. These are the only two things which can happen. In these two cases only you will get that error. So you have to ensure that URL, that callback URL, is the one which should be configured in the connected app. Because after successful authorization, because if you see here, if we more drill down this request, let me kind of copy paste this request to explain you better. So you will see what happens. This will basically explain you the flow. What happens is when you give your credentials, right, when you give your credentials, it first calls the authorized server of Salesforce and passes the client ID in the request along with the client secret, right, and it provides the redirect URL. Now this redirect URI is a callback URL of the app, and it gives the response type as code, and state is kind of like an optional parameter. So since the response type is code, that's the reason you are getting an authorization code, and that's the thing that we were seeing here, right? Once you basically gives your credential, right, once you give your client ID, client secret here, and you give the response type as code, you will get kind of, you will be redirected to this callback URL, and you will get in the first step the authorization code in the response. So this is the authorization code that we get, right? Now once we get the authorization code, if you remember, we use this same authorization code to get the ID token and the access token, right? So that's the next steps. The first step you see is the exchange authorization code. That is, it's like hitting the authorization server and getting the authorization code. Now the next step is fetching the identity of the user, or in other words, is nothing but getting the access token of the user, right? This is the access token that you get. So this access token indicates that your login is successful. If you kind of like see this request also, what happens in the second step? Yeah, if you see, like it, once it first it calls the authorized endpoint, right? Once the authorization is successful, we get the authorization code, right? Then it calls the token endpoint of Salesforce. It's similar to OAuth. It's similar to OAuth. It calls the token endpoint of Salesforce, right? And it uses the grant type as authorization code. Why? Because we are first using, we have first called the authorize and we have passed the response type as code. That's why it uses the grant type as authorization code. It uses the code. This code is nothing but the code that we got in the previous step. It passes the client ID of our connected app. It passes the client secret, and again if and the redirect URL, like the callback URL. So this is the second call that it does in the internally. So first it gets auth code, authorization code, and uses the auth code to call this URI. So if this call is successful, we would get two things, as I was telling you, right? One is as usual access token, right? And we would get ID underscore token. This is the special token that we would get. The reason we would get this token is we have configured this particular OAuth scope in the connected app level. So here you will get, you see here we get the access token, which is nothing but the session ID, we can say, of my user, and this is the ID token. Now if you see clearly, right, so if you drill down into these details, this is how it will look like. This is how it will, this is how the basically the response is looking like. Access token, this is ID, this is ID underscore token. If you see this information I was telling you, right, this is like a JWT kind of a token. You see this is one followed by a dot, then there is another thing, right? So a JWT token also looks like this. So this particular token is a special token that we are getting in OpenID, and if we decrypt this information, this is what this decrypted information is looking like here. So if you see here, it is showing me all the details like my email, right, my family name, my given name, right, my local nickname, phone number. When a picture is there, right, it is giving me giving the pictures, URL, right? So it is giving all the zone information, right, the time zone, and also it is giving all the other details. So this particular token decrypted information is here. So, and why all this informations are coming, right? Because first of all, we have configured OpenID in the connected app level, and also we have included the standard claims, right? If you remember profile, first name, and all. That's the reason if we are getting all this information. So if any end user wants to use Salesforce as an OpenID Connect provider, then they can follow this step. They have to create an OpenID kind of They have to create a connected app in the Salesforce level, and right, and then they can call our Salesforce uh, UI, like Salesforce API, right, in the similar fashion. And then like they will have an access to this user info, right? If they want to access any of these details and any user details and want to perform any logging in the system, they can do that, because those informations will be available, because we are including the standard claims, right? And yeah, and you see we have a refresh token. Why we have a refresh token? Because if you see in our connected app, we have included this particular scope as full, right? We also have a full scope here in right. We have this full access. Also we have this refresh token scope enabled. That's the reason we are getting this refresh token as well. And you see in the scope, the most important thing, it shows refresh token, OpenID, right? This API and full. These are all these four scopes that we have added in the connected app definition. So this is how it looks like in here. So now if we do a next button, right, basically we get to see the entire user details, right? If you see here, right, you see this response, right? So what it does is like does a call to this user info standard endpoint services slash OAuth slash user info endpoint, which will give you the additional details of the user. Like you see, this is the subject, this is the user ID, this is the org details, the nickname configured in the org, right, nickname, and the other details like given name, profiles, and you also get the URLs of the org, right? If you want to access the metadata URL, right, you get to see how, all this information. So this user info endpoint, which is standard endpoint, right, this gives all the other additional informations of this particular user, like what is the endpoint URL, what is the profile, what is the email, name, nickname, right? All this information you will get. What's the status of the user, right, in the org, right? It's active or not active, right? It gives all these things. So this is basically this is a playground. This is an Heroku playground which you can use to, if you want to see how we can use Salesforce as an OpenID Connect provider, right? This you can play around in this particular app, and you can like you can see more examples, right? So this is how we can use Salesforce as an OpenID provider. So we have explained here two things. One is the connected app part we have touched, and we have also seen from the playground perspective how we can like simulate how like if you want to use Salesforce as an OpenID connector, right? Then how we can use it. Now we will see another example where we will use an authentication provider, right? We will use Gmail uh, to kind of like authenticate. Basically, we will use Gmail's credential to authenticate and log into our Salesforce org. We will not provide our Salesforce username and password to log in. So we will use Gmail's credential to kind of like authenticate and log into Salesforce org. So for that, the first thing that you need to do is, in our case, since Gmail is the one, right? So we have to go to Google Developer Console. You can just type in Google Developer Console. You will be redirected to this page. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to go here and just click on this option here to create a new project. So you can give any name here. So to see org, OpenID, something like this, right? And just click on this create button. You will see here somewhere it is showing create project, right? So this is where the project creation is taking place. So once the project gets created, right, so you will see this listed here. So you just need to click on this. After that, you need to go to this OAuth consent screen. So you will get to see this screen, right? So you need to choose external here, then click on create. You will get to see this name. Just give any name, giving the same name. You need to give the email address. I'm giving my email address here. You can choose your app logo here. That's up to you. If you want to choose the app logo, you can choose from here by browse option. Then you get to see an option here for authorized domains, right? So let me first type in my email address here. And in authorized domain, right, you can simply type in salesforce.com and force.com. These are the two things you need to type in. Just click on save and continue. You get to see the scope screen. Just click on this and select all the scopes, right? User info scope, the profile scope, the email scope, the profile scope, and OpenID, right? This is the third one is a crucial one, because since we are doing OpenID, right? So we need to enable this OpenID scope in the Google end. So we just need to select this, click on update, and just click on save and continue, right? So yeah, so the consent screen got created. Then you need to come to the credential screen, go to this create credential option, and just select OAuth client ID as an option there. Choose web application from here and keep the rest as it is. We'll come back to this section later. So the moment it gets created, right, you get to see two important things. One is the client ID, and another is the client secret. So this two would be required from the Salesforce end. Now what you need to do is you need to go to that relying party org or the Salesforce org where you need to configure this. So in my case, I'm using this org as the org where I want to configure the authentication provider. So you need to navigate to auth provider first, right? And click on this new button. Choose from here OpenID Connect. Choose here Gmail. You can give any name like Gmail, OpenID, something like this. Now you need the consumer key and consumer secret, right? From where we will get this. So this one is the consumer key. You can simply copy, paste it here. This one is the consumer secret. You can copy and paste it here. Now we need this authorized endpoint token and user info endpoint, right? So this authorized endpoint would be nothing but the Google authorized endpoint, which is this. I will simply copy and paste it. We need the token endpoint, which is this. And I need the user info endpoint, right? So this we can simply copy and paste it. Apart from this, we need to pass the scopes. So the scopes that we have selected in the Google side, right? Those scopes we need to pass. So we have selected their email, OpenID, and profile. So we need to select this, and we need to select this. I will come to this part later. So this is the class. This is the registration handler class that is necessary when we need to create authentication provider, and we need to choose the user with which we want to run this class. So after creating this class, so after creating this authentication provider, you will get a couple of links. You just need to copy this callback URL and go to your Google settings, open the app, and just add it here, the URL. That's the only thing that needs to be done after the authentication provider creation in the Google site. Once this is done, what you can do is you can simply open this class, right? So if you try to kind of see this class on a high level basis, what this auto generated class does is, so whenever an authentication provider is configured, right, this class automatically gets created. Now this class basically implements an interface called authentication.registration handler, where it kind of it has two methods there. One is create user, another is update user. So based on certain condition, it checks whether the user is already present in the org. If it is present in the org, it simply doesn't create the new user, it just updates the user. Else it creates a new user. So that condition is written here. So in the create user method, so it basically checks whether it's can create user. There's a can create user method. It checks whether the user is present or not, and based on that, it basically creates the user, or it updates the user. So what we would do is, for simplicity's sake, so basically in this class we could write the business logic. So but for simplicity's sake, what we will do is we will just get rid of these methods right now, and what we would do is we would make it a little bit simple. Okay, we would, what we would need right now is like these two methods which are mandatory, right? Create user and update user, we will keep it as it is, and we will just check in create user whether the data.email, now this data.email will be the Gmail's email address, right? So we will first check whether there is any user present in our org whose federation identifier is equal to the Gmail. Data.email is nothing but the Gmail's email address. If the user is present, it would simply return that user, right? And in update user method, like update user method will come into picture when the user has first signed in using this authentication provider. So next time onwards, when the user again signs in, right, using the authentication provider, this update user method will be called, because the user will already be present at that time, right? So the update user method will be called. So I have purposefully kept it as blank because there is no logic which I have right now. But if you have any logic that needs to be implemented whenever the user logs in again, next time, right, onwards, right, then you can implement the logic here. So this is how I've kept it. I've kept it simple. I'm just validating whether a user with a federation identifier is present. If it is present, I'm simply returning that user. That's the only thing I'm doing. So let me update this. And another thing that I would do is I would go to my user record, right? Because I'm considering my user is, since it's a developer org, right? I am considering only my user here. So we will have this federation ID here, right? So here what we would do is I would give my Gmail username, sorry, Gmail email address as the unique identifier here. And why I am saving it in the federation identifier? Because I need somewhere in the user record where it's like a unique. So federation identifier is kind of like a unique place. So I'm storing that one, and the same thing I'm using in my code as well. If you see my code, right? If you see my code, you will see I'm using the same thing for checking purpose, where federation identifier equal to data.email. So yeah, that's pretty much same. I think we need to just configure from the user side, and at the same time, what we need to do is we just need to go to my domains right now and kind of configure your login page there. So I think it's in the domain one. So you need to select the option. So I selected the Gmail OpenID as the configuration option there. Yeah, so the moment it is selected, just copy this domain. So this one is essential because you need to, otherwise you would not see this option in the login page. So the moment you log out of this, right, you see this page, you see this option Gmail OpenID. So the moment you click on that Gmail OpenID, it goes to the Google page, right? You just choose the account, and once you choose the account, basically validates your Gmail credentials with the Gmail server, and if it authenticates successfully, right, it comes back to this URL. That is the relying party or the Salesforce org in which we were trying to log in. So this is how the entire OpenID things works, and this is how it needs to be configured. Thank you.